Welcome to the Paid in Full podcast. I'm Devin Fadul, and in this show, I sit down with creatives of all stripes who have decided to follow their passion and carve out a unique path to success. My goal is to dive into their stories, learn about their philosophies, and share their hard-earned wisdom. My guest today is Rohit Krishnan, startup founder, investor, and recovering management consultant with a wildly interesting Substack called Strange Loop Canon. Rohit is easily one of the most intelligent and fascinating people I've ever talked to. And if you don't believe me, just stay tuned. And again, don't forget to check out the show notes for links to everything we mentioned.
How you been though?
Good, man. I've been busy.
Yeah,
You know, got the practice up and running,
yeah,
and then I'm dipping my toes into a bunch of different activities.
that's the way to do it.
Plus, you throw in family stuff and domestic duties. It's been pretty crazy, but it's fun. It's fun. You know, I don't have
It is
any
fun.
complaint. I don't have any complaints. You know, like I worked for 15 years in the corporate world, and if I was working past 6 p.m., I would want to throw up.
Yeah,
And now I work pretty much 7 days a week, any time of day or night, and it's great.
yeah. I used to have this concept of, or maybe not I, but like of this portfolio life that I came up with maybe a couple of years ago. And like the observation that I had was that at both ends of usually income extremes, you had people who did many things. Like, you might be the CEO and you have like a 5 board seats and like then you do some nonprofit, like people do multiple things. And same at the very low end of the income, right? Whether it's gig work or that kind of stuff. For everybody in the middle who are stuck in the corporate-ish kind of world, you have a very fragile existence. Because like you do one thing and you're supposed to just do that, and you're given these guardrails and like cannot deviate from it. And in some ways, I mean, tech, etc., try to address it by creating this idea of a bring your whole self to work kind of thesis. But it was never really about bringing your whole self to work, right? I mean, it was mostly just saying like, yeah, do the exact same things you used to do before, but now you're allowed to chat about softball or whatever, which is kind of like, I mean, it's irrelevant because it's solving the wrong problem in some ways. Whereas what you're saying now is a little bit more like, hey, I'm not like doing one thing, then doing another thing, or doing this to support that, etc. This is like there are 7 pillars that I have to simultaneously do, and like everything is equally important, if I can call that, or roughly equally important. And that holds true from, whether it's your daughter's softball game or like talking to a client, and these are all interchangeable. And in some ways, like that's pretty much the only way it can be. And I find, I don't know, one of the odd thoughts that I have is, WeWork says like, do what you love, and there's a bunch of these things, and there's this underlying ethos that like what you love is one thing, and you're supposed to just find that one thing and just do that one thing forever, which I think still exists in many places. But what if the thing that you love is 6 things? Love writing and I love doing this and I love, like there's no logical reason it shouldn't be. In fact, like it would be pretty weird if it was one thing. Some people have it, but it's by no means obvious that everybody should have it or could have it, or it is the natural state for everybody to be in order to have it. So I don't know. That was a bit of a long one, but like yeah, I think that sounds like a fulfilling life as opposed to, so when you say something like you work more than before, in a way, like yeah, kind of, but also a lot of what used to be leisure is now work, if you want to call it that, because like you're doing something to get an output. Is that work? I don't know. Like I write. Is writing work? I don't think so, but you could make a rational argument that it is, and that would also be true. Like I don't know.
Yep, I agree, and I think you're thinking about these things in the right way. It's just, you know, I don't know if there's a name for it. Tell me if I'm wrong, but kind of the Paul Millard
Yes.
pathless path way of thinking about work and life these days. And there's definitely a growing wave of people thinking this way, but it's still very much fringe, right?
Yeah, I mean, I actually like the Pathless Path. I had drinks with a couple of old friends yesterday that I hadn't seen in like sort of quite a while, and like we were reminiscing about how many of the people that we know are in this Pathless Path, and I introduced them to Paul's book because they've all got there in different ways, right? One of them said like,
Mm.
whatever, I worked for 12 years, I'm done, I'm retired, I hit my whatever number, and I'm out, and I'm just gonna do that for the next X years, and if my investments do badly, I have to go back to work, then I do that. And someone else is like, I'm tired of this. I'm going to start doing some consulting, some traveling to like various places, Africa. Like there's a bunch of there's somebody who has like moved from Singapore to Barcelona. They're trying to build an app. People are clearly like yearning for something similar. even though they don't really have a name for it or a phrase for it or a conceptual understanding of it, which is a good starting point because I do feel like a larger and larger proportion of people are kind of at least glancing at this life and saying, oh yeah, maybe it's not all it's cracked out to be. And I think we are pretty much in the early innings of that kind of a realization becoming mainstream.
Well, it makes sense because we're kind of at this confluence of, when you think about it, economic factors, technological factors, cultural factors, that this is even an option. I
Yeah,
don't know if any of this, outside of your occasional,
yeah,
to go back to one of your posts about the genius amateur,
right.
outside of those, in the year 1000 AD or whatever,
Yeah,
it wasn't possible. You got up and you worked the fields for 12 hours a day, and then you went to sleep. There was no Zoom, there was no online courses. So before we kind of dive into the meat of this, tell me what you're doing now, what you're spending your time doing, and give me a little bit of a lead up to that. I want the story of Rohit.
Um, the lead up, gosh, I don't know, man. I'm doing a combination of, I think, like two things now. One is writing a lot more. And number two is trying to spend more time actually trying to build things. Whether it's going to end up as a product or a service, etc., is like, I don't really know, but I'm enjoying the process of at least trying to figure out what are different things that you can build at this point. The end result of it, I mean, I'm doing a little bit of investing, etc., on the side as well. And I don't know what the culmination of all of these different facets together are likely to be, whether I'm gonna take a minute to figure it out. But I think the plan is that I have a very clear deadline, which is that we're moving to the US pretty soon. So I think it's important to kind of get that done first and then like figure out where these different strands take me. And some of it might end up in the form of a book. It might end up in the form of a startup. It might end up in the form of a service consulting. I don't know yet. That's the honest answer. End up in the form of more investing, possible as well. So like
What kind of investing?
some startup stuff, and obviously, like public markets are a reasonably large chunk of life, and it's especially tumultuous times these days, which makes for the best investing times.
Mm-hmm.
So, a combination of those. Does that help answer the story of Rohit? I'm never sure. It's like I'm just living this, man. I have no summary.
Well, that was a nice summary of what you're doing now. Which, to sum that up even more, it's a lot of different things. I don't know your background all that
Ooh,
well.
background. That one's
Yeah.
much easier. So like I'm trying to think of the right parameters. I generally chunk it into kind of three buckets. Bucket number one was like when I was in Singapore, I was studying, I did engineering and economics. I built something, sold something, and then ran a fund for a couple of years. That was like first chunk. Chunk number two is I did my business school, came to London, worked at McKinsey for several years advising sort of companies on a whole host of different things, tech related, mainly tech related, tech strategy. And number three is as an investor, where I spent sort of half a decade or more trying to find and invest in awesome, amazing, innovative startups. I think like you could figure out the linkages between the three, and there are plenty. But at least that's how I look at my like chunking, right? Before all of this, I spent sort of several years. Most of my schooling was in India. That's where I studied. That's where I grew up. I moved to Singapore when I was 17 for my undergrad. Geographically, I suppose it's like three chunks, and career education-ish wise, also it's three chunks with one non-overlapping chunk in either of them.
Why undergrad in Singapore and not the States or anywhere else?
Oh, that's easy. They gave me a scholarship. They gave me a full
Oh,
scholarship and a
okay.
stipend. And I was like, that's perfect.
Wow.
If you were a student sort of coming out of India in the early 2000s and like you had the option to get a full scholarship to go study in Singapore, that seemed like a very good deal. Plus, the university was great. I went and checked out the universities in India because you have to write a whole bunch of entrance exams, and a few of them, like, yeah, I remember having a conversation with somebody in IIT, and they said, like, oh, yeah, if you got sort of NTU, that's where you need to go. I was like, makes sense to me. So I did. And at that point, I think like I was not very cosmopolitan in any meaningful sense at all. So it was a big-ish leap, but it was, I think even in hindsight, I think I made the right choice.
Well, that's good. That's a good thing. Were there any significant moments of culture shock, or was it pretty easy?
I mean, I don't want to say no because I feel that would be disingenuous. And I know that plenty of people around had different culture shocks. Yeah, there's a bunch of things you notice. And I think I might have been inured to it a little bit because I studied in 8 schools all across India, and India is extraordinarily diverse, right? So that it tempers your culture shock expectations quite a bit because, like, they have a different language. So like, yeah, you had multiple different languages here as well. So it's like, it doesn't really matter. Food was a little different, but also doesn't matter. I think the fact that it was a much more international type culture was a bigger update because you suddenly have people from sort of a bunch of different places in the world, all of whom are sort of relatively together. There was a huge amount of autonomy. Those are not things that I definitely had sort of growing up. And that was exhilarating. I mean, I would be very disingenuous if I said like I experienced some specific culture shock. I don't think so. It was awesome.
That's great. Do you watch Succession?
I don't. Like I watched the first season and I really liked it. But I have this new thing where, like, if I don't like any of the characters, I find it very difficult to watch it. And this is
Mhm.
like gotten supercharged after having kids. So despite really liking it, I haven't seen anything afterwards.
Yeah, I mean it's pretty huge here in the States.
Yeah, it's a
And it's a
great
great
show.
it's a great show. It's two episodes ago, one of the new characters is shitting on New York City.
Right.
And he's like in this high rise and he's looking down. He's
Yeah.
like, what a shithole. And they're defending New York. And he's like, well, it's not Singapore. It's not Seoul. And he
Yeah.
names one or two other cities. And it got me thinking because I'm a New York guy through and through. I
Right.
love New York so much. I'm going in a couple of weeks. And now I'm like intrigued. Like, I really want to check out Singapore and even some of the Chinese cities or whatever.
Yeah.
Curious what your thoughts are. Like, is that true?
New York is unique. I'm very much on board with that. But I would also say that for a bunch of other cities, like Tokyo is also pretty unique.
Mm.
They have some form of undefinable intrinsic character that you feel when you get down there and you walk around. And there are a few cities in the world where I have very strongly felt that as I'm sort of going around. And like Tokyo is one of them, Rome is one of them, London's one of them, New York is one of them. But like it doesn't transfer. Like Singapore, I think is a phenomenal city, but it's not a city where I feel a certain sense of rhythm and a soul kind of just walking about the place. The reason that the kind of conversation makes sense is because a lot of the when you mentioned Singapore and Seoul and even Tokyo, like they just work far better than New York does or London does. And in sort of in a very specific sense, right? Like pick a metric, it will be better. Like traffic's better.
Public transportation.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It's like you pick something like garbage collection. Speaking of New York, these are things that just work much better. And I'm not entirely sure if those are even the relevant metrics you would choose when you kind of choose a city. Because a city is made up of its people, right? You know, people coming in from all sorts of different places in order to actually come and agglomerate together. And these are all people who have chosen. There are people who are born and bred in each one of these cities. But the thing that makes New York or London unique is the fact that it is a destination city. It's not like a pass through city. And there aren't that many destination cities in the world where you kind of choose the city because of who else is there and the jobs there and the people are there and the life is there, whatever, museums are there, and then you sort of go there for those reasons, as opposed to the cities where you go for whatever reason, then you go like you have to justify it by saying like, no, no, they also have lovely bars, or like, no, 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 they also have the museums. Yeah, true, but that's not what you wouldn't move there for it, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So city comparisons are like, I think people often choose their rank ordering of characteristics and place numbers on each one of them and rank cities and say, like, that's the best city in the world. But like the order of characteristics that matters to an individual it's relatively unique. Both of us might have the exact same characteristics. We might weight them differently, or we might have different orderings. And this changes dramatically as you go through life. So it's very hard to kind of choose one or the other. So when I hear something like that, I'm kind of going like, there was a time in my life when I couldn't wait to get out of Singapore because it is extraordinarily comfortable, but it is a very like boring city in some ways.
Mm.
And that might be a little harsh, but everything is super. It's like living in a shopping mall. It's beautiful, it's clean, it's neat, it's lovely, the nature is great, but it doesn't have that sense of,
Not much character.
yeah, specifically, it doesn't really have that. Whereas now, after having a couple of kids, now I'm like, the things that make a city amazing for me have changed dramatically from when I was like 25. All of a sudden, like schools and school quality is important, and public transport is important, and safety is way more important. So there was the characteristics shift around a little bit. And now I know I was having this conversation yesterday where I was like, I don't think I'd move to New York because the things that make New York awesome, many of those things don't really apply to me that much anymore. Like if I was moving to Manhattan, like I'm sure it'll be great because the city is great. But 90% of what that makes that city great in terms of sort of going out or meeting people and like bumping into each other, seeing the places are not things that are immediately as relevant to me in my life today as it would have been when I was 25, 30. Like your rank ordering changes, and that's perfectly fine. Yeah, people get a little bent up about cities. I mean, I think there are some cities that just grab your imagination and really take a hold of you. And some of it is genuinely indescribable. I'm not entirely sure that you can. And like I said, New York, Rome, Tokyo, London are the ones that I would definitely say like are just kind of somewhere deep in my soul. There's a part of me that is there. And like as soon as I land in any of these cities, even though I haven't like lived in New York or Tokyo, but I've gone enough that when I land, I feel like I'm home
Mhm.
walking out of the airport, which is a very weird feeling, but I just feel it. You're like, oh, okay, I'm relaxed. I can see my entire body just unclench and it's like just this is home. It's fine. And that's the sensation that is, I think, more important. Amenities are, I mean, you'll make do everywhere.
You're in London proper right now, right?
Yeah.
So how do you feel about the Bay Area? Does that feel like home to you as well,
Yeah.
or?
Bay Area is funny because it's like it's pretty much one of the only places where the suburbs feel like home and the city doesn't really. City just feels a
Mm.
little disconcerting to me walking around. But I love the Bay, especially because like I've been in tech for long enough now that in a weird way, Bay has such a gravitational attraction that a large percentage of my both family as well as friends are kind of slowly trickled their way to the Bay, which is a very odd thing to have happen. And as a consequence, it's also one of those places where I feel like if I go tomorrow and I want to hang out with somebody, can I do that? I was like, yeah, because like they're mostly there, which is helpful. And that's not a
Mm.
feeling that you have very easily, right? Because normally if you want to move somewhere else and like, do you know anybody is a pretty major question. And here the answer is like very clearly yes. And I presume you feel similar to New York. That's one of the things that makes it amazing because that's what makes it feel a little bit like home.
Yeah, that's a whole other conversation. New York is New York. I don't think I need to say much about that, but I'm in Pittsburgh right now, which is a second tier city in the States. But you're in a global tier one city, London. Now you're leaving to go to the Bay Area. You've touched on some of the things, safety and schools,
Yeah.
and I mean, I think those are good enough reasons, but is there anything else that you didn't mention? Like,
I should mention all of those are good reasons, but not sufficient reasons. I think the biggest reason moving is like families in the Bay. It genuinely helps to be near family. We already spent summers there mostly. And I grew up with a lot of cousins playing around. That was big for me. Same for my wife. And like during the summers when we spend time there, my sons love it for that reason as well. However, London is, we don't really have too much family here. And I think it is important to kind of expose them a little bit of that.
I mean, you're moving to be closer with family. No, that's it, full stop.
Yeah, and it's important, right? Like I think it's one of those things that if you had asked me this question, I don't know, like 5 years ago, 10 years ago, I would have probably said like this would be number 100 on my reasons to do something, but that's changed.
Yeah, I've got a 13-year-old and then a 9-month-old and then another one on the way. And the plan is once both of the babies are out of diapers, call it 3, 4
Yeah.
years, pick up and just start traveling the world. And that's kind of like the North Star for what I'm doing. Um, Growing up, this could just be perception or nostalgia, blurring my memories, but we were outside all the time, getting into trouble, playing sports, doing all kinds of crap. That's something that Chris Abdelmessi talks about a lot is the latchkey,
Yes.
right? Of him growing up in Jersey. What I'm getting at is I was talking to another podcast guest yesterday. He grew up in India as well. And we were talking about the traditional way of living where, you have 3 generations in the same house, cousins everywhere, like you mentioned, whether it's with family or with other neighborhood kids, that dynamic is just so valuable. So, at least in my opinion, you're doing the right thing.
What you said there, something you said there is super important, like the North Star that you had about traveling with the kids. I think it's great for sort of everybody, right? As a life, like that you are actually able to do this with the kids. I think that's super important. And like The playing outside thing, I don't know. Like, I mean, I was outside sort of all the time. Like, I genuinely do not remember too much time being spent in, and not in an indoors versus outdoors kind of point, but like there's a sufficiently large corpus of people, friends, family, neighbors, whatever, that were available in a sort of nebulous sense. Whereas I feel like that might not be true anymore. And I don't know how much of this is nostalgia to your point, or how much of this is just like transference of rosy visions of the past. But I do find the idea that like that optionality does not exist to be slightly worrying.
Hmm.
And that's all I want, like just the optionality. And regardless of any of these things having the outlook that like you want to expose them to different things, different parts of the world and travel, I think is critically important. I think everybody talks about it. Like Kevin Kelly recently talked about it in sort of the interview. Like it is indescribable how useful it is for expanding one's horizons, and indescribable because it is genuinely very hard to describe it unless you kind of do it. Because if you are asking the question of like, but what will they get out of it? You've already lost because you can't describe it. I don't know. I don't know exactly how to say what you get out of it, except for the fact that it is genuinely useful in expanding one's conception of self.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And there's two overarching topics of work and raising kids. And I know Paul Miller talks about this, is that, if you want to raise kids the right way, just quit your job, right? We put
Yeah.
so much emphasis on this 9 to 5 culture, and it prevents you from doing so many things with your children. And the easy solution, quote unquote easy, is just to get out of that rat race or whatever.
I completely agree with that because I think there is the alternative is sufficiently horrific in sort of many ways, and it changes with ages, right? I mean, like I presume once you're sort of hitting teenage years, then you are present as like a advisory figure, call it, occasionally called upon, maybe needed more occasionally, but like ever present is neither desired nor particularly like you're not taken up on your offer all that often. But until then, there are several years where like life is pretty great, and it would be a shame to not be able to get enough of that time that you get to spend with them, because it's one of the best things in life.
Mm-hmm. You're about to hit that age range, 6 to 10. Man,
Yeah,
I mean, it's all great. It's all great,
yeah.
but 6 to 10 is awesome. I'm not gonna say
Right.
it's my favorite, but and that's kind of that time period where I talk to some of my clients about, maybe that's the time period where you scale back. Why scale back at 60 or 65 or 70?
Yeah,
Scale back when your kids are young, when they can travel with you, when they can play. Don't scale back when they're infants,
yeah,
right? Don't scale back when
yeah,
they're 14, and I'm
yeah,
generalizing, but
yeah.
that's the prime age, man. Like, we shouldn't be focused on saving for 65. There should be a
Yeah.
government fund set up for when your kids turn 6,
Yeah,
and you can take some time off, right? I mean, talk about a
yeah.
societal benefit or whatever. Anyway, this is just me bloviating, and I'm just talking nonsense.
It's not nonsense. It matters. I think it's a more of a, I mean, like even if you rephrase it as whatever, like a slightly more purposeful look at like the trade-off that you're making, the trade-offs do tremendously vary based on time. And it's primarily a question of you have to have the expectation that you will get something out of it, which itself is by no means obvious to a large swath of population, especially because like that was not the way anything was done until fairly recently. And also the fact that, something you said before about if you were in the year 1000, and the degrees of freedom that you had in order to go off and do things weren't super high, which is true, right? And I did this thing at one point. When you look at any of the gentlemen scholars until fairly recently, they all had the luxury to be able to spend time to focus on doing what they wanted to do, and that was essential for flourishing of, I don't know, name a field, like, I mean, art, literature, philosophy, mathematics, physics, all of the above, medicine. And there is no particular reason to presume that that was purely a historical phenomena and it has zero applicability to modern day life. If anything, what we kind of have is today is what Keynes sort of talked about as like the 15-hour, work weeks, which you theoretically could have, but in order to get that, you need to sacrifice something, which is the 3x that you would have gotten if you worked 45-hour work weeks. And that's the fact that like you don't think of that as an available option that you can trade off against, as opposed to like a anathema that we like never got to hit is like it's a weird dichotomy that I feel like when we kind of think about these kind of optionalities.
No, that's a great point. And speaking of kind of, centuries old traditions, I read one of I'm not going to say it's my favorite, but one of my favorite pieces that you wrote on the Substack is on Medici and Teal.
Yeah.
And being a history nerd, I automatically love that, especially kind of that
Yeah.
Renaissance era, and especially Michelangelo. This idea I just find so fascinating. Which it's funny because you wrote it in 2021, which at least to me kind of feels like decades ago at this point.
Yeah.
And in a lot
Oh
of
my
ways,
God.
and especially in this kind of in this framework of work, and how do we produce certain outcomes that we want. And then
Right.
probably the biggest difference to me is now that we have AI and LLMs and all these things. But I don't remember, and I could be wrong, but I don't remember any kind of like sweeping predictions or pronouncements. So have you thought about that recently? Like, and I totally agree with you that that is maybe not a problem that needs to be solved, but it would help society if we had more Medicis. So, anyways, any additional thoughts on that? I love that article so much. Would love to hear more.
Thank you very much. It's interesting. I mean, it's definitely one of the more interesting ones for me as well, because like I go back to that relatively often to kind of read it every few months or so. And primarily because like one of the things I liked most about that is that a few months after its publication, maybe sort of in the next year or the years, there has been a flourishing of different forms of funding institutions as well as recognition granting institutions to provide people with different pathways to do interesting things, which is one of the things that I kind of said was needed. So that's just lovely to see, right? I mean, at the time of writing it, one of the observations I had was like, this was perhaps the most highest ROI human capital investment stuff that I had seen in a very long time, which is insane because it was almost explicitly designed not to measure ROI. And I don't think that's entirely by coincidence. Now, we do see different forms of people creating various different barometers to actually fund people with, whether that's for grants or papers or prizes or like projects. And you see that across multiple different arenas. I mean, everything from the large scale government funded ARIA type stuff here in the UK to like the Polaris Fellowship that is started up by Entrepreneur First guys again here. Like there's a bunch of different ways that you're trying to kind of identify and solve this problem that occasionally you need to find some good people and don't over worry about the selection process itself, and then let them go off and do the things that they think are going to be most valuable and there is going to be useful stuff coming out of it. So in many ways this is a little bit of a corrective to our existing ways of thinking, right, where it's much more like we talked about sort of with the regular ways, like get good marks, go to college, get a good job, and sort of continue progressing alongside it until you have name a title that is kind of written across your chest, which is a very sort of standard mechanistic way of thinking about it. And as that world has been slowly breaking down, there has been the necessity to create different forms of institutions to compete with that. So if I was to kind of draw the line forward from now for, I don't know, the next 10 years, I would be fairly confident that the outputs from some of these differentiated research institutions will actually fall into a much more of a bimodal pattern compared to the traditional academic or professional institutions. There will be more junk, I suspect, or like useless activity. Define it however you would like. At the same time, I also think there will be a few extraordinary breakthroughs that actually do come from specific forms of these. I still hold to that, just because I feel like we have vastly underestimated the ability for people to get stuff done once you actually provide them the opportunity and the space to go off into it. Like, Jim O'Shaughnessy started his OSV fellowships, which is again similar thought process to say like, find interesting people, give them 100 grand, no strings attached for a year, and like let's see what happens. And this is the kind of experiment that I think can result in interesting outcomes. And one of the things that I feel this model doesn't or did not get traction until fairly recently is the fact that this only works if you think about the outcome as a portfolio as opposed to every individual outcome as an indictment on your ability to predict success. So you want 10 out of 10 to hit home runs, you are going to make very different decisions than if you want to make 1 out of 10 to be sort of an extraordinary success. And in any power law world, 1 out of 10 getting extraordinary success is strictly better from a societal point of view, even though it might not be individually better from any particular individual in that group's point of view. I think some of the best, dare I say, like innovation type thinking places understand the importance of it. And then they also understand the importance of having multiple networks that actually integrate these people together. There are multiple pluses and minuses we can discuss here, but all in all, I feel like the idea that we are trying to create differentiated mechanisms for creation, for output production of any sort, as well as recognition, I think is a incredibly important thing. I'm very glad that that's actually happening.
Yeah, and you have this great line from that article. I wrote it down. It's the aura that comes from being a renowned patron has now separated from the actual patronage itself. So now we've got buildings at Harvard with Ken Griffin's name on it, but he has nothing to do with the individual contributors or the students or
Yeah, I think this is one of the things that I loved about the Thiel Fellowship in the sense that for him, this is almost an anti-signal in the sense that the amount of money is minuscule compared to sort of what he normally invests or like does anything with, right? Cumulatively over the sort of decade, it is still minuscule. It is less than one of the single checks he writes for one Series B investment somewhere. It is also way more work to actually vet and identify and work with and sort of work with these people. That is the part that I found most interesting because like it is so easy to write a check if you can and like put your name up on, Stanford. But what is much harder is to kind of do some interesting work that you think is contractually useful just because you're the one who is actually putting in that effort in order to try and identify some people that you think are genuinely talented and help them. I mean, it sounds pretty ridiculous when you think about it, but like so few people do, right? I also find that I think getting an action to do on a docket is much harder once you're sort of relatively successful in any realm of life, almost more than sort of anything. Like money is easy, investments are easy, but like you still only have 24 hours in a day. So you have to make a decision, a conscious decision about how you're going to actually spend that time. And it takes effort for you to say, I'm going to spend some time thinking about this 200K investment and, interview 20 people and select two as opposed to spending that same time on doing this $200 million investment, which almost certainly you would have thought gets me a much higher ROI in any sort of time horizon you care to name, because it just feels more important.
Hey guys, just a quick break to let you know this podcast is sponsored by my company, Adda Financial. You hate personal finance, and rightfully so. Let Adda handle the boring stuff, like investments, student loans, and insurance, so you don't have to. To learn more, check out the link in the show notes or go to addafinancial.com. Now back to the show.
There is that aura of importance that comes with doing something that has obvious benefits. However, like if you want true alpha, that's almost always vibes based, right? I mean, otherwise it would be priced into the market, so to speak.
Is that how you approach your investing now?
Yeah, quite a lot more. I think the two biggest differences in my investing I do today is like I've become a lot less comfortable with purely quantitative investment models at the same time as I've actually started using them a lot more. I think to me, their biggest value isn't trying to systematize your thinking and trying to stop you from making obvious mistakes, if that makes sense. At the same time, they're really useful insofar as models are in trying to kind of explicate your thought processes. But ultimately, almost any investment is a belief in a particular future, right? Like, I mean, you have to articulate a particular type of future, and then that becomes your investment thesis. If your belief in that future was purely derived from some quant method, almost certainly that you will not have enough edge trading that future compared to someone else. It's very hard because alpha decay is incredibly fast, as you know, right? Like it's just they spread at the speed of light, and it's incredibly easy for ideas to get copied. You could try and keep them secret, but even then, like, I mean, everything gets copied. So if you want an enduring kind of advantage, I have become a lot more sensitive to like, what is my view about this particular future and how should I think about what that future might actually look like and work backwards, as opposed to sort of starting at the purely quant level and saying, this is kind of what I want to do. I mean, I could do that as well, but at that point, I would be also defining a different view of the future in that it'll conform in some weird ways to this particular past view of the future. And I'm not entirely sure whether that's always useful.
Hmm.
As always, circumstances vary.
Yeah, and we can't talk about the future without touching on AI. And I think in one of your pieces, you kind of take the Drake equation and
Yeah.
formulate an AI based. I mean, honestly, man, I'd say 70% of what you write is over my head. So I'm trying to process it at any given moment. But there's a future where AI's in it. I'm actually on the same page as you where I'm not going to say I don't understand, but I don't agree with the doomsdayers thinking that AGI is going to, destroy us one paperclip at a time. And along with that, there's a great, have you been listening to Russ Roberts' series on AI
I've listened
at
to
all?
some of them. Most recently, the one with Tyler Cowen.
Yeah, that's the one that,
Yeah.
just came out yesterday.
Yeah.
And Tyler says basically the same argument that you make, I believe, is that basically he says, I could at least open the possibility of agreeing with the doomsdayers if they were to produce a model of it, right?
Yeah.
But according to him, there hasn't been one produced, at least that's viable or verifiable
Yeah.
or whatever. Which I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, kind of dovetails exactly with this article that you wrote, which was, I don't know, when did you write that? Late 2022, so maybe 6 months ago.
Probably. Yeah. It was a little while ago. Yeah.
So my question is, as the future's coming up, AI is going to be in it. What do we do about that? That's an incredibly open-ended question, but
Yeah.
how are you thinking about it today in May of 2023?
So the broad answer is that I am incredibly excited that we have actually managed to create something, which is probably one of the first things that we have created that is able to substantially speed up our ability to think.
Mm.
So that's number one. Having thought through and discussed and read a whole large chunk of like the people worried about AI doom literature, including from sort of renowned folks, right? Like whether it's Jeff Hinton, whomever, I find that almost all of their theories are either completely unfalsifiable in the sense that it is not a set of propositions that we can test and falsify, but almost like a relatively self coherent, internally coherent system of beliefs. And as a consequence, I have the same feeling reading it as I have with reading sort of large chunks of philosophy, which is there are a lot of words being used that are not defined, and as a consequence, your conclusions are relatively flimsy. So AGI is not something that has useful definitions, testable definitions. And that's just one example. But like even AI, if you kind of say like, if you use it in a sentence, that like AI is going to get really good at doing X for some value of X. You could use that sentence and look at AI and go like, should we think of it as a creature? That's one way to look at it. Should we think of it as a sentient creature? Should we think of it as a collection of creatures? Should we think of it as a tool? And all of these has implications on how you deal with the outputs there. And none of the assumptions that actually go into that definition is useful in the sense that like are backed by anything because we don't know at this point, right? What we do know is that given sufficient computation and sufficient data, if you actually put it together in some patterns, for lack of a better word, shoved through a pipeline that is relatively complicated but not super complex, if that's a good way to put it, you're actually going to start getting outputs that are human-esque. And even they, you don't directly get it. You have to take those and train it to replicate your mannerisms. And the interesting thing is that once you do that enough, you start getting outputs that you didn't explicitly train for. Like you train it on a whole bunch of coding, and then suddenly it turns out that it can also have a conversation with you about sort of other pieces of data that existed in there. Whether this comes from some internal logic that it is implicitly learning, what the form of that logic is, we don't know. I mean, this is specific to LLMs, right? Like, and similarly, even if you think about the reinforcement learning stuff like AlphaFold or sorry, AlphaGo, etc., like we have the understanding in terms of how to create it. We also have some understanding of principles of why the output is happening. But there are many things in the world where everything in between is incredibly difficult for you to pinpoint, right? I mean, pretty much any emergent phenomenon is very hard for you to understand. If you change this, what happens here? And the simplest way to think about it is like, when you open your tap and you want to predict where a particular drop will fall, we still can't, right? I mean, because like thermodynamics, like fluid dynamics turns out to be incredibly complicated. Thermodynamics in terms of sort of movement of individual atoms, incredibly complicated to figure out. So I remain bullish on AI insofar as it is the best and strongest technological leap that we have created for making our cognition better. Every single one of us in like life, work, whatever, want to do things better, faster, cheaper. I think that's just kind of normal human nature, right? And anything that enables us to do that better is something that we should be embracing because that's what allows us to live our full lives as humans. Any extrapolation we do saying like this is going to inevitably lead to the result X, I think inevitably is a relatively hard word to use well. In this case, even more so because we're assuming 2 leaps ahead, 3 leaps ahead, and we have no idea what that actually looks like. And so my perspective with this is that I look at it as an engineer and I go like, all right, you create something. Ideally, as an engineer, if you make something, it has to be useful because that's kind of a default assumption, which means like you have to try different ways to make it useful. So today's LLMs do have problems with hallucinations and outputs are not in the structure that you want to. So you work with it, right? I mean, you try different things to make it happen. Like you have to kind of embrace the problem and try to fix it. I see no way around it. There is no every single other action that has been suggested, putting trackers on GPUs or like draconian restrictions where they monitor everybody's computer to figure out whether you're training. It's like we are jumping so far ahead into the science fiction future that we can't even see what we're doing. Like, ideally, as scientists, you need empirical test, you need falsification, and you need to have a hypothesis that you can prove or disprove. And I see none of that. So I'm very much of the same mind of Tyler. Like, the question is not like your organic believability or unbelievability of a particular hypothetical future scenario, because like you remain agnostic as to that. And you say, like, look at what we have today, look at what we are trying to build for tomorrow, and let's just focus on that and like fix the problems that emerge from that and then take it step by step. And when there will come a point when maybe there will be abilities demonstrated that we have not seen before or that we are scared of. Who knows? Maybe we turn it on and like Frankenstein's monster, it wakes up. I doubt it, but if that's what you're worried about, we should see it somewhere, right? Like these are not mythical creatures that go from 0 to 1,000. These are not like Cthulhu waking up, somewhere in the depths of the Antarctic. These are existing, whatever the digital equivalent of flesh and blood is, like systems that we designed and we are creating. And for us to kind of get scared of what they are actually going to be able to do is a tremendous disservice to like the very idea of human ingenuity. I mean, what are we here for if we can't figure out, if we are so scared today of actually trying to create something for tomorrow? I don't get it. And any line of argumentation that can easily apply to not wanting to create electricity as not wanting to create cognition feels to me to fall prey to a pretty deep logical fallacy.
Wow. Yes. I think that the history of being afraid of existential threats is long and deep.
Yes.
I think it could potentially be a little bit different this time, given that this technology has an extra element to it of potentially becoming conscious or whatever we want to call it. That being said, and I mentioned this a while ago, along the lines of why do we assume that this computer is going to want the same things that humans want? Why do we assume that it wants power and control and death to enemies? Why wouldn't it want just as much to be in a cold, dark room for all of eternity? Isn't that what computers want, right? I mean, it just kind of being facetious, but and again, another quote that I pulled from this piece was, quote, "This feels very much like creating an anthropology for a species that doesn't yet exist." That's kind of along the same lines of my thought from a few months ago of what are we're creating another humanoid and we're ascribing to it desires and needs and wants that it may or may not have. And again, this is coming from somebody who's pretty biased against the doomsdayer predictions, but anyways, just a thought.
Yeah, I mean, I don't even know if we know that there is an it there in the first place. Like I said, sort of every step along the way, like, I mean, we can't skip to the end of the movie, right? Like, this is not a, like, if you're watching a movie, a TV show, then there are some narrative conventions that you can expect because that's how the world works. Reality, unfortunately, does not easily correspond to any of those. And as a consequence, for you to assume like 7 chess moves down is probably doing a disservice to yourself and reality, because we live in a relatively complicated, complex world. So to me, the sensible thing to do is likely to be like, you have to actually look at the facts on hand. Regardless of people's belief structures here, there are attempts being made to try and understand things in a deeper level. And people have varying degrees of confidence as to like whether they think it'll work. Like, we have whatever reinforcement learning with human feedback, which, or like with AI feedback, which works for like GPT and like Claude and those kinds of things, which has had pretty enormous success today, right? Like in the sense that we have systems that we can talk to, we can create stuff with. Is that good or bad? Undeniably good. Is that going to scale to every problem in the future? Who the hell knows? Like, worrying that the thing we have today will not apply to a problem tomorrow does not make sense unless you can define the problem tomorrow. Because otherwise, how do you know what solution will actually apply? You got to try different things. There are things being worked on with respect to like mechanistic interpretability, or like, trying to identify what an individual neuron in that enormous vast net actually holds and trying to structure those outputs in and out. I think they are incredibly cool. Will that actually solve the problem we wanted to solve? I'm very doubtful, for the same reason that like we don't start diagnosing psychiatric conditions in human beings by starting with neuroscience in the beginning, right? Like we might use it for specific things where there are chemical imbalances, but there is no substitute necessarily, because these are complex systems. Like in some ways, behavioristic analysis or like is inevitable. You can't get away from it, because like what it does is part of its functionality, and like you have to work backwards, as opposed to saying, if we had enough ability to actually predict what it is going to do at every given point in time, given X input, and then we will know what Y output is likely to be. And you're like, in a reducible system, if you could know that, you wouldn't need to build it. Like if you had the ability to have that answer, then why go through this process in the first place? This is how you get to that answer. And this is my conjecture. I'm not entirely sure whether like it is held by a large number of people, but regardless, I'm good with those kind of attempts, because they're still trying to get to grapple with something that actually exists in front of them and trying to get an answer to that. Everything else beyond it is like some form of futurism / science fiction. And as much as I'm enthralled by both of those things, I would ideally like them to kind of focus on things that slightly more optimistic. That might be a vibes-based analysis, but I find that there is not much value in saying the world's going to end again and again and again without genuinely ascribing a way by which the world ends. It's a little bit like economists predicted, 9 of the past 5 recessions or whatever. It's like, at some point you tune out, right? If tomorrow, whatever, Rubini comes out and says like, we're all going to die and the economy is going to collapse, you're Dr. Doom. What else is new?
Mm-hmm. So on the in the theme of positivity, this is a clunky analogy, but I feel like we're at the stage, it's 1898 and the first automobiles are hitting the road, and we're trying to figure out what this means for society.
Right.
What are some interesting second, third, fourth order effects that you've thought about, positive ones, on your children, on society at large? So we can predict, the car and maybe roads, but can we predict gas stations or shopping malls or the suburbs? So what are those second, third, fourth order effects? So the first order effect is education is going to be revolutionized, most likely, right? So what does that mean, though? Does that mean the entire structure of secondary education in the world? Does it collapse? If so, I don't know. More on the positivity side. Like, what are you thinking?
It's a great question. I in a weird way, I don't think that. I feel education is very lindy, in the sense that collapsing those structures are very hard, right? Like if you think about it, the longest living organizations in the world are probably universities. Like Oxford's older than whatever the Aztecs, right? It's insane. Like they've been here since 1100, and they change over time and blah blah blah. But like the fact that they did change and they're still here, they're still prominent, they're still number one. It's a pretty crazy achievement if you think about it from an organizational point of view. To me, like, I don't know, there's a few ways to think about it. One is that if you start giving people, if everybody had a really strong EA, like an executive assistant, who knows them deeply and can do a bunch of work that they can do and like take things off their plate, what is going to be the result? And one answer might be that like it suddenly makes you, the individual, a whole lot more productive. And you might actually channel that into doing more work faster, or you can take it into like working less. And it'll be interesting to see where this goes. And I suspect we'll probably see a bimodal distribution of some or both of those things actually happening, because we can actually see that legitimately start to play out. Same with education in some ways, in the sense that like the benefit something like this brings is that if you are a autodidact of any form, or like self-taught, or you're a self-learner, I suppose, then the positive impacts on you are dramatically higher, because all of a sudden you can grow from 0 to 100 much faster than you would have been able to do otherwise. However, that also means that if you're not one of those people who are self-motivated to kind of go off and do some of these things, you're going to get left behind pretty dramatically. So in an odd way, I feel like this is likely to increase the bimodal distribution of outcomes across a whole host of different arenas, which is going to have impacts societally in some ways, but also sort of, make the existing differences between the people much wider. I think that is kind of important. So I think like one of the other ways to think about it is also that like, imagine if everybody had a decent, a decent doctor, not a good doctor, a decent financial analyst, not a good one, a decent tax advisor, not a good one, but available. What would be the impact of that? Would they end up using the existing options less? Somewhat, but you would also have a much larger corpus of informed populace in some ways. Are there going to be impacts of that in terms of sort of how they choose to deal with whether it's existing companies or existing solutions, creation of new things, etc.? It'll be interesting to see. I don't know. It's an experiment. One of the other things is like, I have this ratio that I think about, which is time to produce divided by time to consume, and holds true for anything. And almost universally, this ratio is incredibly high, right? Like it takes 1,000 people 2 years to make a movie and takes me like 2.5 hours to watch it. It is an enormous delta in terms of sort of time to produce divided by time to consume. Anything that can reduce this is only going to increase the demand for getting more of that stuff. I genuinely think that is amazing and fascinating. And it holds true for everything, right? The one area where it might affect it the least is probably like novels, because writing and the way you write is such an incredibly important part of that process that you can't really outsource it. Even there, you can outsource or at least speed up your references or like your research or what have you, and especially for nonfiction, but also for anything else. So put all of those things together, I suspect we will start to see a much larger number of cultural artifacts emerging as one of the side effects, which is counterintuitive, I think, because like the assumption is that artists are dead, but I don't think so. I think in fact, like your ability to create just went up exponentially. Like the business models will break and evolve and like change as they have always done. But I think this will be fascinating to see how things play out. There is a question of whether by purely speeding up some of these parts, whether you're going to have a tremendous jump in the scientific productivity arena, where all of a sudden anything from like medicine to material science, whether you're going to be able to get massive leaps. I'm unclear whether we are going to get there immediately, just because like experimental verification is usually the bottleneck for these things as opposed to theoretical prediction. But even with that, I think like we're probably seeing orders of magnitude in terms of sort of speeding up for some of these things. I don't know whether these are third or fourth order enough. So I actually don't know. It would also be interesting to think about what the leapfrog dynamics here are likely to be. A lot of the innovation is coming in Silicon Valley, Europe. What is the impact of the availability of these things in like Kenya or in Nigeria or in India? It can only be high. It can't be low, because all of a sudden, like just like mobile phones leapfrogged landlines, I suspect people will adapt to using these things much faster in those worlds as opposed to here, where there is still a little bit of a stigma around like, did you write that email with ChatGPT? Whereas you just jump over that entire hurdle, at which point like you're probably going to have much closer integration with a AI runnable or AI run type organizations, movements, arenas that you might not get anywhere else. So I don't know if that answers your question, but at least these are some of the speculations I at least find fascinating to think about, at least on the positive side of the spectrum.
Yeah. Man. So I've got this idea in my head of we look back 200 years ago and we say, man, people spent 80% of their time just trying to create food to eat, right? And you don't have to go back that far in terms of time or space. Anyways, maybe people will look back on us today and say, wow, I can't believe people in 2023 spent 20 hours a year doing their taxes, or 100 hours a year collectively talking to customer service, or all of these kind of low level upper middle class activities that just don't need to be done necessarily, right? I wonder if that's what people will look back at in 10 or 100 years. I don't know, just a thought more.
No, because a huge percentage of work that happens in today's world involves people acting like robots. Lawyers, tax advisors, accountants. These are human APIs that interface between us and some meta organizational super entity that we have created collectively, which is kind of helpful for us. So as a consequence, it is at least useful to think about and saying like, will these things going away be useful? And I find it hard pressed to think of one person who would say like, no, we want, lawyers. It's like they're essential. Like there's no reason to. Like, I mean, they exist for us to kind of make our disagreements explicit as well as kind of identify some clear guidelines. And like, it's not about replacing them, but it's about the fact that you want to make that process more efficient.
Yeah, or replace them altogether. But who knows?
I mean, I get the thesis that replacing them is going to be very difficult, if only because a lot of the reason for their existence is not to do with them inherently, but it's their existences to kind of push us to think deeply about the shit that we care about. Like, you're trying to do an investment in a company. A large part of what the lawyers talk to each other is about, like, what do you actually mean, and kind of nail that down, right? And yeah, a lot of it is pointless shit, but like, you still need somebody to clarify that, because it's two human or multiple human beings with different points of view kind of trying to get these things written out in a particular structure. Some of it I feel is irreplaceable for the reason that human belief systems are not easy to kind of make explicit, so that job does need to be done by someone. Maybe not, hopefully not, but I think that's what will make the longevity for some of these jobs exist, right? At the same time, I've often thought that like, if you're investing in a startup, in many ways, what you and the lawyers and the company together are trying to kind of come to is to say like, this is the waterfall curve of how my cash is going to get paid out based on the round that I'm investing, blah, 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 of the outcome of the company, and iron out a bunch of corner cases. There's no logical reason that this requires enormous duplicated effort. I mean, there's a little bit, but like not really, right? I mean, these are not super complicated things to do in the first place. You just have to do them every single time and kind of work through the numbers and whatever. Yeah, make that easier so that we can write out an SHA in a day, as opposed to sort of, there's no reason like we shouldn't be able to do that. And I don't know if it's an LLM problem necessarily, but could we together create a solution that actually is super optimized towards writing legal documents? I mean, Harvey's trying to do that, so we'll see how that goes. Again, I would be very happy with a 50% reduction. Mm-hmm. I don't necessarily need to see then a complete elimination.
Yeah, I totally agree. How are you using LLMs and ChatGPT today to help out your day-to-day or anything?
Oh man, I use them for a lot of stuff. Like, I use it regularly for research, to read up on new stuff, etc. Ask questions from multiple different angles and like kind of get a sense of how it's thinking. I find it particularly useful for like probing type questions, or find me more of X similar to Y. Like yesterday, I was trying to just messing with it to try and understand what is the technological equivalent of the Krebs cycle in metabolism, which is it's an ungoogleable question, because it doesn't really make sense, but it kind of makes sense. So you can play with it and kind of see if there's anything equivalent, or like, one of the answers it gave was like cryptographic hashes, which is, I think, is an interesting answer. I don't think it's true, but I think it's interesting, and it kind of starts a seed that you can then go off and research, and you can ask questions and find out. So that's one. I use it a little bit for so that process, it happens like sometimes for writing, for like specific, again, understanding specific types of questions. I kind of ask that, give me more examples of red queen races that have happened in the past, or like, I don't know, economic incentives that have actually made people act differently in the governmental domain. Like, then you can kind of ask it some of these weirdo questions that are harder to Google, and then kind of get to very specific answers. I've also started sort of coding a lot more, trying to figure out like a whole bunch of different types of things, like reading. I created something to read S1 documents and answer questions for me, or like 8K documents, 10K documents, which is super useful, like just as a interface between me and the financial world.
That sounds like a great business idea right there. I mean, you're in
It
fintech.
it might be cool. Maybe we should do it.
Just summarizing 10Ks into a paragraph.
I mean, like, there is so much information about these things that exist out there that like it's freaking annoying for you to have to do it individually, manually, and not super hard to do it yourself, which is much better because then
I mean, the data sets are there, right? I mean, you've got transcribed earnings calls. You've got the 10Ks and the 8Ks and the 10Qs.
Yeah.
I mean, how hard could it be to put that into some, I don't speak this language. You put it into some pile and then have an AI analyze it.
Precisely.
Right.
So I did it for like, I was just messing around with sort of, for example, like Microsoft's all historic filings and Tesla's historic filings to ask it questions, or like extract some information from it, and you can get some interesting stuff out of it that you wouldn't necessarily get otherwise, unless you're like addicted to reading footnotes, which is okay, but like it's unscalable. It's only so many footnotes you can read in a day, right? Like, like it's just more than anything else. So I did a bunch of those kinds of stuff. I created like a sales email engine for my wife's startup to like, given a bunch of people and their websites and their LinkedIn's, etc., it scrapes it to kind of read information. You can create personalized emails that you can send to individual people. That's interesting. You can do that. Categorization engines, like, I don't know, man, like web scraping that you can create in a bunch of different ways. I created an agent that can autonomously figure out and go off and do small tasks. It's not very good because none of these things are very good. They hallucinate.
Mechanically, are you using just ChatGPT or
I use the API. I use OpenAI APIs. I don't have access to Claude Anthropic's API, but I hope to play with it, and the open source ones like Llama and so on. Like, I have a couple of those things running somewhere.
Okay.
I got to be honest, the first time in a very long time that I found coding fun again, because the time to exciting insight is like so fast. This is one of the things that like ChatGPT just like explodes your productivity in terms of, because all of these are useful things, but I wouldn't have built any of them. It required me to take like a month to build each one. They're not worth it. A weekend, totally worth it. Like the effort to reward ratio completely dramatically changes, and you get to build stuff for yourself that actually works the way you want it to work. It's a big plus.
Off the top of your head, do you have any ideas on how large language models could affect my industry of kind of personalized financial advice? Maybe not affect, but help.
Help, yes. I mean, the way I look at it is like, if you had an analyst who could take in information from your clients and kind of digest it to give you relevant questions that you needed to go find answers for, would that be useful? Not to replace you, but like, pre-screener sounds stupid, but something that just genuinely is able to kind of do that. I expect it to be useful because I would like it, because that's how I think about it, right? And that can go from like, I mean, you can choose the particular data formats that you want to ingest, whether it's like financial statements is one thing, but this is more useful for like qualitative data that, you have the interview transcription, you can have it figure out, oh, major life events that are coming up. I'm going to get married in a year, or like we're going to have kids in 2 years, or like I'm planning to, like you said at the beginning of the call, like, my goal is that in a few years, I want to actually be able to go off and travel with my kids. And those are goals that are difficult to make explicit, but exist implicitly. And once you tease them out, to identify them in a conversation is sort of incredibly useful, because it allows you to get a much better sense of what each client is like. Another thing that I am partial to, and I don't know if anybody has done this, is one of the annoying things about a lot of advisory-ish conversations is that they're highly unstructured because almost definitionally they have to be. However, the problem with them being unstructured is that if you store them in your database, the database is unstructured, which means you can't search them easily, extract information easily. And there is a middle step here where you take the unstructured data, you convert it into some form of a structured data so that you can understand, like, for every conversation, I wanted to fill out these 7 fields, whatever that might be, or like each field has these 5 questions. Those are places where LLMs can meaningfully impact. You have specific questions where it can possibly help you as well, whether it's selling properties or like, home values or whatever. Like, I mean, there are individual questions where it can help. But I mean, that's kind of normal, right? I mean, you would use something else if not for LLM, so it doesn't really matter whether it is there in the core of it or not. But as you can see, like most of my, I wouldn't call it sympathy. Most of my thought process is that like similar to the stuff that I said, like, there exists a corpus of information about the customer or the client at their side as well as at your side. Having the ability to analyze it and ask it the right questions, which most people will not be able to do, is a huge advantage. How will it impact? I don't know. We will see. But I would be hard pressed to think of a world in which like this doesn't make what you're trying to do way more interesting and way more fun.
Way more impactful as well.
Yeah, because like you can suddenly do a whole lot more, right? Remember in the first conversation we had, like you showed me sort of how you structure a person's things, and there's a bunch of questions that like any increase in its filling, not just filling it out, like you can actually enrich it in every conversation, which is not something you can do easily today, right? Like that's a big benefit. And that's how like you actually start creating value for the customer, this like the client side, your side. Like you can extract insights that would have gone unnoticed because you can say like, hey, the first couple of times we talked, you seem to be extremely focused on X, but now you're focused on Y. And like you would not be able to extract the insights from those conversations very easily without the tools that is somewhat similar to like LLMs, because you can embed all those conversations, you can index them, you can ask interesting questions, you can have comparative analyses across clientele, across sectors, across investment preferences and stuff. Like you can, like I said, it's a cognitive boost. It's like, what would Devin do if there were 20 Devins and each Devin had like an extra 5 hours in a day? And it's like a hell of a lot, it turns out.
No, it's similar to the lawyer model where it's not 100% that's going to be eliminated. It's 40, 60, 80%, whatever it is. And I mean, certainly it's the low-level administrative crap that can go away, but it's also the mid-level stuff that could potentially go away. And what should I talk about with the client today? To my little, advisor AI, and it lists a few things, and then I'm kind of the transport, the veneer between the client and the information, because you're going to need that human touch, right?
And it's also that like they're just not that good yet, because you can't have an AI that understands someone's principles, life stage, etc., across all of its dimensions well enough to give personalized advice. Because I mean, it would be weird if they could, right? Because that's not what they're built for. But it doesn't really do that. So as a consequence, like you're not just a veneer, you're the integral part of the whole system. It's just that along with the other tools that you have, this is a tool that now you can create and use. That's the way I see it. Because it's like, is there a tool that you can create and use? Yes, this is it. Let's use it. So if you use it, you're going to be able to provide better advice faster. You have better recall, you have better understanding, and like you can use that however you want, right? I mean, if all you want to use it is to say like, I mean, different people will use it very differently, which is kind of the whole point, because like it's the Devinness of it will come through as opposed to the GPT-ness of it, because generic stuff is generic. Anybody can use it. You can go type in, whatever, I'm a 31-year-old Stripe engineer and I have X RSUs, what should I do? And it'll give you some garbage, but like, I shouldn't say that. It'll give you decent advice, but it might not be applicable to you in specific, because like there's a whole lot more different types of questions before it kind of reaches that particular conclusion. And I think the value that every advisory service has with it is the fact that like you have multiple clients, which sounds silly, but it's only by linking those things together that you suddenly start being able to provide better advice.
Yep, exactly. I couldn't agree more. And I'm excited to see where it is. And maybe maybe it's you and I, maybe it's me and somebody else, but I'd love to I'd love to start building something. One of the first things you do as an advisor is you collect all the client's documents, insurance stuff, mortgage papers, tax,
Right.
throw it in a pile, and just have AI, if nothing else, just come up with a list of questions, a list of
Yes.
things to think about. Simple as that. Rather than me spending 20 hours, 40 hours pouring through the documents and the
Yeah.
footnotes and all these things. And right there, I mean, that's a $1 billion business right there.
This we can build. This I can help you build for sure. This is the thing that gets me going back to our older conversation of like, you have this superpower in front of you, and I cannot help but look at it and go like, this is so amazing that you are now going to be able to do these things that seemed like science fiction. I remember sort of 15 years ago, the friend that I had a drink with yesterday, we did a project together when both of us were in undergrad to teach a robot how to walk. Now, we were complete geeks and we gave every variable the name of a different Prince of Persia character. And as a consequence, debugging it became impossible because they were all named, like the names of variables had nothing to do with their functions, but purely for aesthetically pleasing reasons. That said, I remember the pain that we went through to code that damn thing. Like, took 3 months of both of us, all-nighters, to kind of like make it to the most basic thing of like learn to walk in a straight line. And that process, that methodology scaled up sufficiently with GPUs gets you freaking magic. And it is gorgeous to see that, like, you have the chance to see both of these things in this lifetime. And we can continually worry about the future. That's totally fine. And like somebody should, I guess, but like, sure. And you should be asking the questions about it. Like, are you building these things safely? One of the biggest issues is that if you have a public facing LLM product, like you can do prompt injection attacks and actually start stealing sort of existing prompts or information. It exists because there's no known solution to it. However, it is also true that like having this ability suddenly supercharges the ability for like you to replicate yourself, which is an ability that like we have literally not had ever before in history. To not take advantage of it is like a crime against humanity.
Yeah, and you said you were building a robot. I don't remember where I read this or heard this, but it was something along the lines of you may be able to build a robot that can play soccer, but can you build a robot that can be a soccer fan? Yeah, you can build something to do a rote, kind of a physical activity, but can you teach, in this case, AGI or whatever, to love something, i.e., to be conscious, something along those lines? And I just find that so fascinating.
This is one of those things where like the behaviorism type of thing comes out, because like if you told me that you're a soccer fan, I will know something about what that means because I have context. I understand what soccer is. I understand what soccer fans generally do. I played it as a kid. Like, there are so many references to like a collective shared sense of humanity, which is what enables me to understand the phrase "I am a soccer fan" coming from another human being. If like ChatGPT tells me I'm a soccer fan, I know that it does not have any of that internal referent, right? Many of them at least are lacking. And as a consequence, to become a fan is something that is not the outward demonstrations of what being a fan means is easy to replicate, but like to understand what being a fan means is maybe not easy to replicate. And between these two things lies a large swath of philosophy. And I don't even know if we will solve it or will not solve it, or whether we'll be able to get an adequate description of what AGI means to the point where we can understand what it is, or like a mechanistic understanding of sentience. Hard questions and plenty of research going into any one of these areas. To me, like the ultimate question is a little bit more practical of like, we have this thing in front, it's continually getting better, it's adding capabilities one after the other. However, it is something where the only benefits you get from it are according to how you use it. So like now, same as anything else, like we had software engineering before, or like, higher order programming, whatever, like let's build the next thing. We should use it. And then as we're using it, we will learn like, oh, damn, it doesn't work for X. And then we'll know something specific. I learned that like if you want to do multi-level categorization problems that have more than sort of 100, 200 categories, then sometimes it doesn't work because it hallucinates in the middle. And then you have to train it by saying like, you do multiple prompts or injections or whatever, like to kind of embedding it or whatever to kind of teach it to say like, hey, stay color within the line, stay within the boundary. And that's engineering, right? I mean, that's part of the process for you to kind of train everything. So I sometimes look at it a little bit like I have an employee who doesn't know anything. It's genius, but doesn't know anything. And like, you got to continually train them as an employee. You got to like cajole them and like show them examples and like tell them again when they get it wrong. And like you got to kind of keep doing it over and over. And that's fine. It's the new form of software engineering. And like as a consequence, we will be able to build things like, hey, here are 40 documents. If I read it, these are the things that I would have come up with as an example. Like, what do you think? And then see what happens. And it doesn't need to be perfect, right? It just needs to be useful enough that like your 40 hours gets cut down to 10.
Mm-hmm. Maybe one more question, if you don't mind.
Shoot.
I mean, you're working on, I don't know, God knows how many things. Maybe not work is the right word, like we mentioned earlier, right? You're doing a bunch of different things. Let's say you had to start generating income, next quarter, and you had to pick one of those. You had to pick one of those things, whether it's going to get a job somewhere or building an app or whatever the case may be. I don't know. Those are dumb examples, but if you had to pick something, what would it be?
Damn, hard question, dude.
Or is the answer go back and work at McKinsey?
No. That was fast. I don't know. I would probably build a product and sort of go sell it, similar to the stuff that you're talking about. I mean, I could do things like I could make my Substack, or at least part of it, paid and write a book. I've been thinking about it, but I don't know if I really want to pull the trigger. I kind of like the interactive vibe that I have with the large majority of things, and I'm worried about it if I switch. I could take a few more NED type roles, which I've been offered. I haven't really taken any up.
What is that?
Like a non-executive director type roles, like for sort of companies, profits, etc. That's an option. Same for like advisory, consultant type options. I mean, I don't know where my pathless path leads just yet. So I'm slightly open is maybe not the right word, or agnostic to kind of where this leads. What I would really like is to kind of build a few things over the next 4, 6, 9, 12 months, and then sort of have the universe reveal the answer to me. I appreciate, as I'm saying it, is that is incredibly unsatisfying. And that's how I'm feeling about it at the moment anyway.
If that's the answer, that's the answer. I don't know, man. We could talk for several more hours. So let's I
agree.
For another, whether it's recorded or not, but what can you plug? You've got Strange Loop Canon on Substack. By the way, what is Strange Loop Canon? What is that? I couldn't figure it out.
There is this writer called Douglas Hofstadter who wrote the book called Godel Bach, An Eternal Golden Braid. And one of the concepts he came up with to explain consciousness was this idea of the strange loop. So a strange loop is a highly recursive loop of information moving back and forth within itself. Hence Escher, the drawings together, Bach fugues that kind of twist together, that together he posited creates the basic building blocks of intelligence and consciousness. And I love that so much that I basically named the blog after it. It's still one of my absolute favorite books to think about and reread and visit. And it's a little bit like an encyclopedia. You can open it anywhere and you suddenly are confronted with an incredible mind. He has a follow-up to it called I Am a Strange Loop. Cannot recommend both these books highly enough. And neither are the types of books that you should just sit down, read one stop to finish and just end. They're gorgeous.
Maybe this is a stretch, but you could say that you and I are both on our own versions of a strange loop in a way.
Not a stretch at all. This is the way.
Cool, man. Well, it was great catching up.
It was wonderful talking, dude. I mean, we'll talk more about
a
bunch of different things that came up today, as well as more. I can't wait to jam again.
All right, man. This was fantastic.
Peace.
Thanks again. Talk soon.
Bye.